right. So can everybody hear me? Great. That's awesome. All right, we're seated in the right seats, so that's great. Many of us just met each other 3 seconds ago, so this is awesome. So what we're going to do is have a series of questions. But first, I am going to introduce myself, and then I'll turn it over to our esteemed panel here. I'm Clinton West. I am the president of the Supply Chain Security Practice at Aardwolf. We do a lot of things and fun, good things, supply chain risk and tabletop exercises. But my career, I retired, as Mara said earlier. Last year, I was the director of supply chain risk at CIA and in CIA for more than 28 years, and then prior to that in the Navy as well. One thing I want to start with before I introduce the panel is how and what this means to me from a supply chain security perspective. So as the director of supply chain risk at the CIA, we saw a lot of things. We had plans for just about everything. But from a critical minerals perspective, this hasn't been an issue that has been at the top of everybody's mind for many, many years, and is now getting the attention that it deserves. We had plans, we knew things that needed to happen, but as Mara really couched it perfectly, it's an economic warfare type of event that's going on right now, with China holding a lot of the cards. And we're left to try to fix that. And I think with forums like this, with or other organizations, and certainly the EO that was dropped and the NIST 800, really starts to put together a plan that all of us can really march towards to try to get an advantage that we don't have right now and provide that advantage. So as we start to go through the questions, if you can think about that and really think about some of the questions that you have for these panelists, because we do have a wide range of experience here, I would encourage you to do that. So with that, I'm going to start to go down the road of having them introduce themselves. So to my left, I'll start with Geoff.
Yeah, hi. Name's Geoff Atkins. I have a consulting business, Strategic Minerals Group, but my background is I've been developing rare earth projects for about 20 years. So I started in Australia, obviously, with Linus on the Mount Weld project and the Malaysian Advanced Materials plant. Worked through Africa, gone up to Canada, and I'm currently working with a company called Ucore in developing a rare earth separation facility in Louisiana.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Evanna. I am the co-founder and senior advisor at Critical Minerals Forum. So we are a 501c6, which is a nonprofit trade association. We spun out of an existing DARPA program called OPEN, O-P-E-N. So the idea of OPEN is that we have developed AI forecasts of pricing, supply, and demand of all critical minerals, all 55 of them, in conjunction with USGS. A part of the reason why we spun out a nonprofit, which is highly unusual for DARPA and DOW in general, is because we wanted to be able to disseminate the pricing and supply and demand to our trusted members, who are basically American or allied processors, investors, and buyers, including a lot of the primes. At CMF, we hold all the models right now because every DARPA program has to tech transfer or be commercialized. And so we hold the models right now for tariffs and for pricing, for price floors, which I believe someone asked about earlier. And then we obviously do a lot of facilitation of investments, and we help a lot of American companies and allied companies navigate the Byzantine labyrinth of government contracting.
Good morning, I'm Dana Bralver. I'm a senior analyst at Sayari, which is a corporate and supply chain risk illumination company. I work with our government clients on illuminating their supply chains, identifying corporate risk, including for critical minerals and rare earths.
Hi, everybody. I'm Brad Dragoon. I'm a partner with HKA Global. HKA is a global advisory and disputes firm. For the past 15 years, I've worked in corporate investigations and business intelligence. My background's in anti-money laundering, financial crimes investigations, sanctions compliance, and export controls. I've led large financial institution lookbacks, including one for a Pakistani bank, Turkish bank, as well as a number of other multi-jurisdictional investigations.
Great, thank you. So we're going to go ahead and get started with some of the questions, and I'm going to start with you, Geoff. And as you meet with policymakers and decision makers, what is the main thing, especially in these times that we see with competition with China, what do they misunderstand when you talk to them?
To me, there's two real things that they misunderstand. The first is the complexity of the supply chain, and actually understanding, particularly when you look at rare earths, that there are 5 or 6 absolutely distinct phases of the supply chain, and each one is very, very different and highly specialised. So to actually go right through that supply chain takes a lot longer than what people think and is far more complex. The second thing which people don't realise, and to be honest, this is one of the biggest problems I see with the industry, is that the vast majority of people who and executives of the companies supposedly developing these projects, they either don't understand the supply chain themselves and the complexities themselves, or their intention is to mine the market, not the actual mine.
Geoff, do you see the same problems in Australia as you see in the US?
Probably worse in Australia.
Oh, really? Okay.
Particularly around the people involved. And one of the things I'll go through in this panel is the importance of the people and actually the level of expertise in the people.
Great. Evanna, kind of same questions. When you sit down from your forum perspective, how do you see it, and what are you trying to emphasize when you're talking to these policymakers?
It's a little bit tricky, right? Because we're kind of created by policymakers right now. Just one quick thing, though. It's interesting you talk about people, because right now, even within the U.S. government, when we're looking at deals coming through EDU or OSC or DFC when it comes to mining, we don't really have the technical expertise, right? We have a great team at USGS, but they're overworked, and they're being paid for by DARPA right now, right? And so we're trying to find new talent that can help us do the technical feasibility, and we can't find any Americans. So we literally had to write exemptions to hire Australians. So a big chunk of like, which deals are we going after? And right now we have, a spreadsheet that is on Palantir that's like 1,000 deals we're looking at, and it's actually a team of Aussies that are helping us decide which one is actually good for the government and whether or not we want to invest in it equity-wise or loan-wise or a mix of both, right? When we talk to our members, we actually realize that we can't talk about it from a China perspective, because if you really want American companies to join, a lot of them have businesses in China. They have operations in China. We have a lot of members that are very well known names that we're not allowed to talk about, including if you don't have Android phones, you have the other type of phones, right? But we're not allowed to say their names or publicize them. And that's because they're really, really sensitive about China. And so the way we talk to them is, hey, Chinese, economic competition, that's something that the US government is obviously working on. But for you guys, it's about decreasing or de-risking your businesses. Why would you rely on only one vendor for a core part of your business? Like, that's just really bad business practice. And that's how we're making our cases on why they should come to these events.
Yeah, great. So Dana, as you sit down with your clients and you have this fantastic tool that Sayari has, what do you have to emphasize to them? And when you're talking to them, what do you say?
Yes, I don't engage with policymakers, so I don't want to prescribe this to them, but I would say that a common misconception we see all the time is people are treating geography as proxy for control. And so if something says mined in the DRC, that doesn't necessarily mean it was only DRC entities and persons involved in that mining process. You have to look at the corporate structures, you have to look at the trade patterns, layer those together, plus additional data if you have access to it, to find out really who is responsible for that mining. Even if something says manufactured in Germany, where was that product refined? Where was it refined before that? That's a very long process. And I think, as a couple of other people have said, we're taking a lot of that information at face value. You're looking for that direct tier one engagement that a lot of entities in the US and allied nations have, but you really have to dig a little bit deeper and find that data out there to be fully aware and make an informed decision on your risk, whether it's just relying on just a single vendor, or if you know that there's potentially an SOE, a state-owned enterprise, or a sanctioned entity that's been somewhere involved in the supply chain process.
Brad, from your perspective, when you talk about critical minerals with your clients and your decision makers and policy makers, what do you emphasize to them, and what do they fail to see while you're sitting down across the table from them?
So recently I was working with the NATO Innovation Fund on a risk assessment and how they were going to risk rank possible investments in dual-use technologies. And there was a significant apprehension on working in jurisdictions outside of the alliance. And I think it's critical for the alliance and outside and kind of globally in de-risking China to look at other jurisdictions and add that to our supply chain securely. So for example, the lithium supply chain. We were looking into upstream producers in Argentina, refining opportunities in Mexico, and ultimately end finishing in the United States, and how to develop a secure way to receive those critical minerals in the US, again, de-risking or decoupling from Chinese suppliers, but also securing the supply chain for the US and their allies.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to go back to Geoff real quick, and I know a lot of you are very familiar with USTDA and all the studies that are promoted there and go through the DFC and the World Bank to support these kind of efforts. But from your lens, Geoff, being in mining operations, which is very unique and fascinating, what makes one mine better than the other? What makes it promising? What makes it doesn't? So you're not wasting your time with these other things here that really won't pan out. And how do you differentiate the good and the bad?
From my perspective, the way that I typically will look at a project is about the pathway to production. So it's actually understanding how do you get from a resource right through to production. And that's where critical minerals, and particularly rare earths, are a little bit different to what I'd call your base commodities. Base commodities are actually quite simple. You just work out how big your deposit is, you divide it by 20, that's the size of your operation. Every process is the same. You can basically design that plant on day one. Critical minerals and rare earths is very, very different. It's highly complex, so you have to have a very good understanding of the mineralogy. So you've got geology, but the mineralogy and the ability to process that is the most important. The third thing, this is where the pathway to production comes in, is the ability to fund it. And this isn't just about size, it's not just about cost of production. This is actually about understanding what you need to do to achieve bankability. And this is the biggest problem that a lot of mining companies come across. They've got great deposits. There's a lot of deposits out there which could make good money if you just applied the right strategy to it. But they don't understand that pathway to production. They don't understand the requirements for bankability, and so these projects sit on the shelf. And that's really the key thing from my perspective. You've got to understand the project. You've got to understand how you can develop it, in a way that will satisfy your customers. Because the other thing with rare earths and critical minerals in particular is you've got to apply a pull model. It all comes from the end customer. It doesn't come from the mine. You've got to satisfy your customer and your customer requirements. So you design the project around that, and it's amazing how many projects which historically you look at and have been looked at and said, that project will never get up. You can't make any money on that project. But if you take that different lens, suddenly you've got a number of these projects where you can make good money. You can make a really good rate of return.
So I think what you're saying is that we're still funding these programs in isolated pockets. And it's a perfect segue to Evanna, is since we're doing that, Evanna, are we getting better at talking to tech, talking to capital firms, talking to government to ensure that we're not developing and having partnerships in isolation?
Yeah, we definitely are. I think there's a slow shift to something where, let's call our previous economic statecraft tools were pretty much centered around assets, right? Like a mine is one asset. But then we're starting to realize, especially in contested areas, that it doesn't matter if you have control over that mine, because that mine needs to go on a road, right? You need to ship it to a port, and if that port is owned by China, you have the same problem. So now what we're saying is we're shifting from asset strategy to a corridor strategy, right? So now we want to work not only with the private sector, but let's also work with MCC, the Millennium Corporate Challenge, which a lot of people have not heard of, but they work in a lot of strategic countries and they only fund infrastructure. They're one of our development agencies that was started by President Bush, right? And then we need to work with other firms or other IFC, EBRD, other agencies around the ports. So that's how we're starting to see things.
Great. So I think we've all seen over the past 6 months, there have been a number of feasibility studies, Mozambique, Zambia, Nigeria, that have come out by USTDA and others to look at how those countries can support our appetite for critical minerals and rare earth. One of the challenging things, as you know, is ensuring that it doesn't, you're doing good business with good people. So with that in mind, Dana, as you guys start to partner with organizations that are looking to extract mine processing all the way through the supply chain lifecycle, procurement, warehousing, transportation, operations, and ultimately disposal, how do you ensure that those people feel confident that they're doing good business with good people in all those tiers?
It is difficult to do. I think starting early on in the process and doing due diligence, generating a very deep network analysis on all of the entities you're going to be working with is really critical from the start, because once you've engaged in that with that partner, it's going to be harder to decouple down the road. So I think, early and often, just some continuous monitoring is really critical. I think too, there's part of the life cycle as well is we have access to data in Sayari in addition to the trade and corporate data that we're better known for, but doing a little bit of insider threat analysis too is really helpful. So on individuals, you can identify, academic institutions, different academics that are part of the process as well, to ensure that, the knowledge and the trade craft is kept close hold as well, just to prevent some spillage. And it's not just the companies you're working with, but the people, as others have set up here. And so I think just making sure you're being extremely thorough in all of the risk mitigation, risk analysis, and threat mitigation.
Brad, how do you set up a workflow if somebody's doing business with an allied nation to ensure that there are no, in this case, I'm going to say it, Chinese in there, and especially with China, since they have the Belt and Road Initiative and they're growing as we speak? How do you ensure that in your workflow?
So interesting enough, we are close partners with Sayari. We use their tools in our supply chain due diligence and investigations, and through those tools and others, we're able to get rungs into corporate ownership, 6-7 layers deep. We have a lot of clients coming to us with foreign entity of concerns, especially if they've received clean energy tax credits. Those can be retroactively taken away by the IRS for 10 years. And so when our clients come to us and they say, we need to understand our supply chain from upstream all the way through midstream and ultimately to distributor, we look at each of those rungs, and it gets a little tricky as you get more upstream. A lot of the offtake agreements that the midstream manufacturers have are not public. So there's a number of different investigative avenues we can take, including human intelligence. But the information is generally out there. If you combine custom records and shipping records with corporate ownership and structure, you can really understand who you're doing business with, where your goods are coming from, and ultimately kind of protect the integrity of your supply chain.
So I'm going to shift a little bit to on the ground and processing, and start with Geoff here. Is that the processing element of this is very, very difficult. Geoff, could you describe how you go through the process of establishing somebody as a competent and worthwhile processing engagement firm?
This is really the challenge. I think if you look at, from a processing perspective outside of China, there's probably 4 or 5 people in the world who, from a process engineer perspective, have what I would classify as the required level of expertise. But that's also needing to balance out a technical knowledge with the commercial understanding, and that's where it also gets very difficult. Problem with rare earths and a lot of these critical minerals is every project is different. Every project has its own unique flow sheet. It has its own unique processing plant. But also when you go through the supply chain, you've got mining, you've got beneficiation, you've got extraction, you've got refining, then you have metallization, then you have alloying, then you have strip casting, then you have batteries, magnets. Every single one of those stages requires its own level of expertise, and this is where the challenge comes in.
Geoff, do they worry, when you talk about all these different elements in the supply chain for processing, do they worry about the Chinese, the people that you're talking to, or is that just another funding mechanism that they have to use because the system's slow?
Both.
Okay.
China is, in the one hand, China is, from a mining perspective, China is your biggest customer. And the other thing that's happening at the moment is the prices that Chinese firms are willing to offer for your product is significantly higher than what you can get elsewhere. So the question is, do you take the short-term view, take that sugar hit, or do you take the longer-term view?
Right.
And that's part of the biggest part of the issue at the moment around feasibility studies.
Yeah.
So that is a challenge, but look, the Chinese influence doesn't really interfere too much with a lot of mining companies because it's a potential tool. It's something which you can use, and a lot of companies will use it as a bargaining chip to try to get funding out of governments.
Evanna, when you hear that and you start to talk about some of your clients, is the Chinese factor always on the top of their mind?
When it comes to refining and processing?
Yeah.
So I think for our members, it's a lot cheaper to do it in China, obviously, right, to do refining and processing. But I think if I sort of wear the other hat, which is if, I don't know, you give me $10 trillion, be like, build refining plants here in the US or processing plants in the US. And let's just say that I have a magical wand and I can do permitting in 2 years, right? I don't know if I can put refining plants anywhere here except on military bases.
Sure.
Because nobody wants to live next to one, right? You think people don't want to live next to data centers? Try refining plants. Right, like literally, unless it's exempted, and so the question right now is like, for us is why do we keep on trying to out China, right? And like, okay, what we want to do is we want to catalyze all of the mining and the processing and the refining when maybe we should go back to what America does best, which is innovate. So how can we think about synthetic mining? What are some of the technologies out there? At DARPA, we have, so we're in the strategic technology office, our biotech office. They've done a great job of taking the tailings and then using cool science and actually they use some kind of a microbial whatever, beyond me, but they're able to recycle 98% like yield, success rate of NdPr, right? Like that's great, and that's being commercialized as we speak. So how can we actually look around and like foster these entrepreneurs and innovators to come up with just more effective and more environmentally friendly way of getting at the same thing? We have a member right now who is so gallium is one of the three elements that China put export control on. And you need gallium for your quantum chips, right? But the problem with gallium is that it doesn't do well in high temperature. So they said, hey, instead of gallium, why don't we put synthetic diamonds on it? So now, it's a Michigan-based company, and that's what they're doing. So how can we actually find substitutes as well?
No, that's perfect, and kind of leads into the next question to Dana, is when you're doing your analysis, and certainly critical elements and rare earth is different. It's a different kind of analysis. What are those triggers that you see using your tool and your experience that makes it different than a conventional risk search?
It's a great question. I think there are several elements, but first I want to talk about just some of the core risk indicators that we look for all the time. And so there's UBO, there are unique corporate structures. We look at supply chain enablers and trade patterns, trade irregularities. And so I don't know the specific critical minerals and rare earths very in depth, but I will say that if you apply those patterns and frameworks to the critical mineral rare earth space, I think it will yield some of those unique aspects. And so I would say that when you're looking for alternatives, like Evanna was just saying, you can search across business purposes in our corporate data and try to identify a network within those companies that might have the ability to bolster your supply chain, provide an alternative or a substitute, and so that you can have that diversified supply chain and access to then do your due diligence and research into. But I think having a framework for delving into the data surrounding all of these entities is really important. And so again, the ultimate beneficial ownership, any corporate structures, when I talk about that, there's a lot of jurisdiction-specific corporate structures. So for example, in China, you might have the domiciled corporate headquarters in mainland China or in Hong Kong, but then they actually have a different name that they use trading externally outside of China. And so making sure that you're aware of all of those specific elements when you're starting to find alternatives, start up a refining or mining practice are really key.
Right, and I like the continuous monitoring aspect because that is a requirement. ICD 731, which is the Intelligence Community Directive, NIST 800, the EO talks about it a little bit, that was dropped today, is there has to now be, or there is a requirement to have a tool that continuously monitors your vendors, which goes down to the nth tier. So extremely, extremely hard. But with that in mind, Brad, when you see something, what is a trigger for you that says, I need to do a deeper dive?
There are a number of red flags that we'll see. So in a recent investigation for supply chain due diligence, we first saw that there was a domestic supplier, but we knew that the components were coming from overseas and the company was very new. So that's an initial red flag. They hadn't been in business a very long time or hadn't been registered a long time. And we looked into the director of that company, and they had no prior experience in the industry. We were looking into solar panels and solar panel components, and the director of the company was in the real estate industry 4 states away. We looked a little closer, and we saw that another director was affiliated with a subsidiary of a large Chinese company, right? So then the red flags start to emerge. If you're looking at transaction risks, if there's remittance instructions that are for an entity that's potentially different than the one that you're dealing with. In terms of global supply chain, look into the port of origin. Is the port of origin where you would assume the goods are coming from? In terms of sanction risk, in an investigation I was doing years ago, we saw that the port of origin was originally listed as Jebel Ali in the UAE for a bitumen shipment. We knew that there was a large bitumen production site in Bandar Abbas, Iran. We also identified this risk through the use of shell companies in Mauritius and Seychelles that were using P.O. boxes, but were ultimately shipping the goods. And then we went to Pakistani customs records, and we saw that the ultimate port of origin was Bandar Abbas, and that all of the bills of lading had been doctored to evade sanctions. So there's a number of red flags that you need to really put together to understand the underlying activity.
Let's stay with you, Brad, real quick, where you brought up some choke points. We all know about what's going on right now with Strait of Hormuz and Strait of Malacca. Those are easy choke points to identify. What are some of those choke points that, when you're doing your analysis, that we wouldn't in this room all recognize as a choke point to help you illuminate and provide some analysis and some, more importantly, some mitigation?
The choke points are evolving, and I think the key choke point that we see right now, and what we've all been kind of talking about, is China controls the midstream production in terms of upstream for a lot of rare earth minerals. They're also in control of that. But for U.S.-based and I think allied distributors of these critical products, the choke point can be the evolving regulation. Because as these companies start to engage with the needs of different distributors, they're running into different regulations depending on administration, depending on jurisdiction, and all of a sudden they're not able to procure goods from certain jurisdictions. So, looking down the road, and I'm not a predictor of any kind of global policy, but if we do end up, hypothetically, in a conflict with China, for example, and it goes from a situation where certain companies can't do business with state-owned entities to all of a sudden we can't import anything from that jurisdiction, that's going to become a significant choke point just based on the regulations that we have in place.
Mm-hmm. Dana, for you, what do you see as a different choke point that you guys are analyzing right now using your platform to try to highlight and illuminate?
One thing for the previous question, I loved all of Brad's points that he made about risk indicators to watch for. I would also say one thing we see in our data, in addition to everything Brad covered, was reliance on a single supplier. And so while that's a choke point for us, I would also say that when you're looking at an entity of interest that you're investigating and they themselves are relying on a single supplier, it often is a trustworthy relationship that they've developed, that those incorrect bill of lading data that Brad touched on, that was impossible in part because they have this, de facto understanding that we're gonna lie on what good we're sending. And so when you see that, I would also have a little orange flag go off and wanna look into that. And it relates to what I see as another choke point is it's often a game of whack-a-mole. And so while we're becoming more flexible in this space, people are understanding that you need to go down to the nth tier supplier in your investigation and due diligence. These companies are extremely flexible. They can open their registration business and then conduct business very at a rapid pace for 3 months, shutter their businesses, and then quickly open up another one to do the exact same thing. And so it goes into the continuous monitoring, it goes into having access to as much data as possible, finding those commonalities, those patterns when you're looking at common shareholders. Are these businesses sharing an address? Are they located in a secrecy jurisdiction or have a TCSP that's located in a secrecy jurisdiction? There are a lot of analytical threads you can pull on to make a judgment. Maybe it's not going to be a high confidence assessment, but enough so you're clued off to that there's something going on. And so the additional choke point I would say is just that these businesses are very flexible and we have to be as well.
For sure. And if you haven't read it yet, the Chinese are trying to counter our ability to look into their supply chain, Decree 834, 835. You can look it up if you don't know it right now. That's a direct competitor to 1260H, ICD 731. So it's going to become harder to do exactly what Dana and Brad have talked about, but it's not insurmountable. It's one-upping each other, but it's super challenging. So from your perspective, Evanna, you have a different lens from a choke point perspective. What is your perspective on that?
In like solving the problem.
Yeah.
Um,
I know it's not you're not going to solve it in 1 minute, but what is your idea of choke points?
Yeah.
How when you're talking to those people that you're talking to, what advice do you give them?
I think there are two things that I'm constantly battling. One is overclassification. The majority of our CM programs at DLW, at DOE, for some reason, they're all TSSCI.
Yeah.
So you have investors coming in who's like, I want to know what kind of investments I can make in this country. I know that this country is of strategic importance to DLW because I want EDU money, which is great. And then they go to a program and they're like, what's in your pipeline? And literally the answer is the pipeline is classified. I'm like, okay, so like understandably the reasons for why the deals are on a pipeline probably should be classified because a lot of it is NatSec. But the pipeline itself should not be. And so I'm constantly like doing this battle thing where they will come to the CMF and my team and be like, okay, now we have to do parallel reconstruction using OSINT to justify like why this is on our pipeline, right? And that's just like it's just a waste of energy and headspace for everyone. So the DARPA Open program is actually the most, like 98% of the program is unclassified. And so I've been arguing like maybe you shouldn't put it as unclassified, but like a part of it should be at least just non-classified so that we can work with investors around the world, right? And then the second part is sometimes we don't, it's, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. So good example, tungsten, we really need tungsten everywhere. We finally went and found tungsten mine in Nigeria, made sure that, it's legit. And then we realized that, well, in order to actually export tungsten out of Nigeria into the US, where we actually found like a processing plant here, which was like a miracle, there was a 40% tariff because it was a blanket tariff that we did on Nigeria. So then we go to Treasury and Commerce. Can we get an exemption, right? And you're like, oh, okay, we kind of just shot ourselves in the foot,
Which
and now
takes
we're
time,
doing
yeah.
mental gymnastics and paperwork.
No, that's fantastic. Real quick, Geoff, on your perspective, and then I'm going to have the last question.
To me, from a development perspective, the choke point purely and simply is people. People with expertise.
Yeah.
And that's firstly looking at the design of the project, understanding an execution strategy, but then also if you're building a plant, where do you get the expertise of the workforce? If you need a couple of hundred people to operate a rare earth extraction and separation plant, where do you get those people with that level of expertise?
That's great.
That's the biggest choke point that there is.
Yeah, I like the people part is, I think a lot of you have hit on that, is there's just not enough people to do it. So I'm going to put them through a real quick scenario while we have a few more minutes, and then I'm going to open it up to some questions. So I'm going to read from my notes here and we'll start with Evanna, and then we'll come back around. Assume the mineral remains available at the mine, but an adversary restricts processing technology, shipping access, insurance, financing, or a critical chemical input. How quickly would a government or industry recognize the disruption, and would they know which missions, companies, or technology would be affected first?
I would say industry would probably know that it's a problem within the first 48 hours. And then it will take us about 6 months, the US government, to recognize that it's a problem. and then we might be able to get it into the NDAA to go and fix it. So give another like 8 months.
Okay. That's fair.
Yeah.
That's a good answer. Dana, for you. I'm not going to read it again. That was too long.
You know, I would say that, like, on the data side, the data isn't immediate necessarily. And so for people to be able to access the data, to identify an alternative, a workaround, finding another entity that can ship these goods, handle these goods in the specialized way they need, it'll take a very long time. And so, again, like, the more you can do early on to identify alternatives, make sure you're not relying on concentrating your sourcing from a single place. You have to have a deep bench to be able to respond in a reasonable time frame and not have to
kind of like
wait
getting away
for
what
like a whole
Evanna
year.
said earlier was you don't want a single source.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is very challenging. So, Brad, speaking of that scenario, what financial or organizational ownership would be a trigger for you in that event? And really trigger that deeper dive in that kind of event.
Yeah, so if an entity or a client of ours that was a distributor or an end user was looking for an alternative supplier, they would want to look into first the jurisdiction of where their supplier is. They're going to try to identify all the supply chain risks. In terms of corporate structure, as we mentioned, companies that are more established, that have a significant online or global presence, that have a strong reputation within the industry is something that if you're looking for an alternative supplier, and ultimately understanding where all the upstream components are coming from. I think that when companies do their initial due diligence, the first check, for example, is a sanctions check.
Sure.
And looking at just the SDN list, I don't think is very helpful. For example, recently, a number of upstream miners in the DRC were placed on the Special Designated Nationals list in the beginning of the month. Those miners and the refiners in Rwanda they have no access already to the U.S. or Western financial system. They already have strong uptake agreements with China, likely, or other midstream partners. So that's not really the first place to look. It's really who's the midstream and who are they partnering with ultimately to understand that risk.
Yeah, especially trying to get to it before, knowing who's in your supply chain before that triggers something from the government. We're working with a client right now that came to us and they're like, hey, AFRICOM has kicked us off the contract because of some risk. We're like, you probably should have had a process in place before, and they didn't. So now they're having to try to backtrack. And the government, I remember being in CIA where a lot of companies, not a lot, but companies would come to us and they would want to know why they're on the list. Well, I can't tell you why you're on the list. One, you could be under investigation. Two, it could tip you off. I don't know you that well. And three, our response to them always was, you should have known about this before and you should have had a system in place to really thwart this before it became a problem, like a Sayari or somebody or what Brad does. But we aren't, this economic warfare kind of environment we're not really used to. And certainly these tools like these AI tools that support us in our supply chain analysis weren't there 10 years ago. But it's not an excuse, and I think it'll become more of a problem as the government, the U.S. government especially, starts to really look at all of our supply chains in much more in depth. But Geoff, given that scenario, I know I went on a little bit of a tangent, but for you, what happens when a project is identified like this and there's a problem? Have you seen this in your mining experience?
Yes, look, I think you basically answered the question. Is if you're developing a mine, absolute critical is to undertake a rigorous risk assessment and contingency planning. So for all of the scenarios which have been, which you outlined, they should be identified early on. It's not rocket science. Yeah. And if A happens, you do B. Like fundamentally, and as you said, 48 hours, I'd give it 6 hours that you notice that there's
Yeah.
that there's a problem, and you take steps. You never rely on a single path, and you always have your mitigation strategies. It's just, to me, that's management 101.
Right, and I think that's a tier to what we're talking about, is illumination and mitigation. I know a lot of companies were brought to my attention on, hey, I can illuminate this for you, and my first question would be, how much does it cost? My second question would be, can you help me mitigate? And oftentimes, I would say 99% of the time is like, can't help you mitigate. Here's a tool that will help you survive. But I didn't have, 15 analysts that are you're gonna illuminate problems for me that I have to shut down, or I got to mitigate. I need people. And I think the tools are getting to the perspective of they're starting to provide that mitigation aspect so people can react. So I applaud them for all of that. But with that said, I want to thank the panel. But now, how many minutes do we have? Really? Oh, this is great. Okay. So let's go ahead and open it up for some questions. Hopefully there are some. And we'll go from there. And then we'll have some closing thoughts from the panelists. What's that? Okay. There's a microphone right in the middle. If you have a question, I've been asked to have you line up there. That would be great, so we can get your recordings on for the people that couldn't make it today. We have a perfect question here. Go ahead.
Good. Cool. Thanks, guys. That was great. There's been a lot of talk today about the importance of people. And obviously, the issues at hand are far more than linear. We can't just go and buy a mine, processing, all of these things. But what are we doing to match, this huge increase in awareness of kind of economic defense? There's an article yesterday, I think in the Journal, we're paying iBankers now $400,000. We're allocating capital. But we can't just go, as you've said, go and buy a mine. That doesn't solve a problem, right? We're aware of processing, but more than that, from the secondary and tertiary orders of impact and effect in these areas, there's a lot of nuanced cultural issues. How are we pairing and modernizing, innovating around the soft power element and matching that to what we need to do economically, whether it's a CA or a FAO, aspect of what's going on in that arena, and how effectively is it pairing today?
I think within the U.S. government, we're doing a lot of retraining of State Department, Foreign Service officers, because they tend to become our econ officers in different embassies and consulates. We're doing the same thing right now with Commerce. They just finished their big rework to become better commercial officers as well. And then in terms of, we have a program called the Workforce of 2050. That we actually started for the microelectronics office at DARPA that we're now sort of implementing. And so we are actually partnering with universities as well as high schools and teaching them about economic statecraft, and also encouraging, and this is something that I'm really passionate about in my personal life, outside of work, which is restarting a lot of vocational schools that have disappeared. And so there's one that will be announcing that will be in Brooklyn Navy Yard in New York, where we're taking actually a lot of high school kids and then putting them through that program instead.
Is it part of the STEM program? Like a STEM type of program to get some more advocacy, Evanna?
Yes,
Okay,
yes,
great.
for sure, yeah.
Great, awesome. Anybody else want to take that question?
Just from my experience, as I mentioned, I did some work with the NATO Innovation Fund a couple years back, and so Europe is performing kind of a similar function. I think what the question referenced was, I think, the Office of Strategic Investment, where the U.S. government is looking for investment opportunities in dual-use technologies and sensitive technologies. Europe is on the same path. The funding is still probably not what's needed to develop some of these more advanced technologies. But there is that understanding, and again, from my perspective, I've always been in the private sector. I do see a lot of the solutions, at least starting in the private sector, with a lot of startups that ultimately, though, need public sector funding. Mm-hmm. And so I do see a great opportunity for the U.S. government, the DoD, and Europe to get more involved in kind of this defense venture capital space. And I think it's going to be a great opportunity, especially in critical minerals. to kind of develop the industry and move the industry forward.
Joe?
If I could just to make one point, I think the importance here is that we need to take a strategic view, not a tactical view. You know, the key here is look at the amount of money being put into mines. My personal thought, to be blunt, a lot of that's being pissed up against a wall. You know, let's put some of that money into funding university programs in metallurgy, process engineering, those types of things. Build that long-term capability. Short-term, yes, we need a short-term fix. Truth of the matter is, any project is 3 to 5 years away from being in full operation anyway. You don't need a lot of material now to satisfy the immediate requirement. So around the world, there's enough resources there that we can fund and we can find that and to build that capability. You just need the right, you do need the right people. There are people out there who can oversee it, train people up, but let's start taking a long-term view.
Great. Dana, do you have a thought?
Yeah, I think too on the kind of educational advocacy side, when we work at Sayari with our corporate clients, a lot of what we do too is explaining what a dual-use good is, how some of the goods that are being shipped by our client or used by our client might be involved in, you know, another country's military-industrial base, things like that. So I think too, when you engage just with a supplier or anything, having that conversation, talking about it is really helpful too, because this is like a very new problem that's getting a lot more attention now, but oftentimes it's just a lack of understanding or awareness, not someone intentionally transshipping a rare earth or integrated circuit into Russia, for example. And so I think that helps too.
Great. Sir, do you have a question, your name and your organization? That would be great.
Is this on? Perfect.
Yes, sir.
Thanks. Omar Ahmed Badami. I'm the Director of Wargaming at the Irregular Warfare Initiative.
Great.
We've heard a lot of discussion today about a need for alternatives. I think the term deep bunch was used previously. But de-risking from China is one thing. The other thing, too, is domestically generated risk. I'm curious what your perspective is about de-risking from the unpredictability of tariffs. We've discussed already on the panel the importance of intermediate products and going from country to country. I think Evanna's one of the people who raised this about the mine in DRC and Rwanda. But if you have a processing stage that goes through, say, 3 or 4 different countries, multiple different companies involved in that, and a blanket tariff gets slapped on there, well, you've got paperwork, yes, but paperwork and getting an exemption isn't guaranteed, and that takes up valuable time during which another investor from China or the Gulf or another country could jump in and steal that opportunity. So what do discussions around de-risking from those types of tariffs look like with your clients, and how can we do that effectively? Thank you.
Evanna. You mentioned your name, so we're going to go with you.
I don't know if I have a good answer for that. We've seen the private sector get really creative around tariffs because they do want to fundamentally work with the U.S. government because the U.S. government has the money, right? So we've seen some of them going to Native American lands here because sovereign lands are, probably shouldn't say this too loudly, but they're exempt from tariffs. We've gone on trips with them and we met with chiefs of whichever nation, and they're quite keen on it. But you know, we don't suggest that typically to our clients. It's just so much more complicated. But otherwise, we kind of tell them like, look, like from a data perspective, when we have our pricing and supply and demand models, we have a toggle for tariffs because we know that sometimes they're coming and sometimes we don't know, right? And so that's something that they can play with, and hopefully that's something that they can put directly into their financial model.
Great. Any of the other panelists for that? Tariffs is a challenging question. Okay, we'll go ahead and go to the next question.
Thanks. Name's Arnie Dupuy with DHT Solutions.
Great.
I want to take the discussion back to the workforce development aspect, which I think is pretty seriously overlooked. And I guess Geoff and Evanna touched on this, but you talk about, well, we've outsourced so much of the supply chain requirements over the last 20 years to the point where I think we're at a serious deficit in skilled labor. My question, I guess, Evanna, you touched on this. What are we doing to recruit a new generation of workers that has to interest them in some of the extractive industries and things of that nature that have become unpopular over the years, and sort of develop this whole new skill set that we've lost, not just the United States, but also our allies in Europe and elsewhere?
Okay, so by show of hands, how many of you here have kids or grandkids? Okay, the majority of you. How many would you, how would you guys feel if your kids were, like, grandkids came to you and said, I want to become a miner?
Yeah, Geoff would love it.
Right? I think the majority of people don't want their kids to become miners. And I'm going to caveat that by saying because there's a bad rep, right? Like, we think about coal plants, and that's what we think about being a miner means, right? That is really no longer the case, right? A lot of them now they're using machines and all these other things. And so, this conference is co-sponsored by SOAA. So I've always said, we need to create an information operations where we're actually changing the narrative on what does being a miner actually mean. Right now, we only have one school of mining. That's the Colorado School of Mines. They turn out about 300 graduates every single year. A lot of them go abroad. And they go to Australia, they go to Canada, they go to South Africa to work for mining companies. So we don't even keep that many of them here. So fundamentally, it's okay, I'm not saying we're gonna make mining the next sexy thing that everyone wants to become, but I do think there's a lot of misconceptions. And so how do we actually just start a broader public awareness campaign?
I'll make two comments on that. First one is exactly as what you say is correct. Mining has such a narrow definition in people's minds. What people don't understand is that the mining industry has been at the forefront of a lot of environmental controls over the past century. You look at, from wastewater treatment, sewage treatment, stabilisation, all of these sort of things, regeneration, all of that's come out of the mining industry. So there's a huge role to play in that. Second thing, particularly at the moment from geopolitical, there's a massive requirement for geopolitical skills and international skills in mining. So I think broaden the scope of what mining means. The second thing is just to take back, 2007 at Linus, we set up a plant and located the advanced materials plant in Malaysia. Everyone says, why did you go to Malaysia? The answer was really simple. There was no rare earth industry there. So in a lot of ways, it's very similar to the situation that you have today here in the US and in other parts of the world. What we identified, though, was that there were skill sets which could be transferred into the rare earth industry. So we were on the east coast of Malaysia, Petronas, with the oil and gas industry. There are a lot of skills there in chemical processing, chemical engineering, which we were able to transfer. You get the right people in with the appropriate skill sets at a high level to train, and that's a 20-year process now. But today, Malaysia would have more expertise in rare earth processing than anywhere else in the world outside of China. And that's the type of thinking that's needed.
Mm-hmm. Brad, and Dana, did you have a comment on that, on personnel? You see a lot of people in your arena that are analysts. How many of them are thinking about analysis and things that would work for you?
People in our industry, my industry specific is more focused on accounting and finance, but I think all of that kind of plays into the skills that are needed to develop the kind of critical minerals industry in the U.S. I don't have much background specifically in mining or extraction, so I can't really comment on that. But just from kind of anecdotally, it seems like if there's a financial incentive to go into a certain industry, someone with an engineering background or a metallurgical background, I see it's a natural fit, and I don't know why we don't have more of that in the U.S. I think the environmental concerns are probably one of the leading reasons why the industry has not developed as it has in the U.S. But in terms of refining and processing, similarly environmental concerns. But I think if there's the economic incentive for young people to go into that field, I think it would really stimulate growth.
Dana, anything on that?
No, I just know that a lot of our commercial clients are very concerned about this, and so I think I'm not aware of any, but I'm sure there are, grants for educational funding or even just rotations within companies. You have to do a few months, years in this sector just to, again, generate awareness and kind of normalize the field and the sector, as Evanna was saying.
So my apologies, we are getting the hook. I know that you have a good panel when there's 5 people really waiting for questions, so we'll stay here afterwards. But I want to leave you with a quick thought, and my lens certainly is from a foreign adversary perspective. During the Ukraine war, as it really built up, we ran out of vendors. And it's kind of like what you described, Evanna, single source vendors. And being in the field for CIA was a challenging but rewarding event. And I remember we needed some people to move cargo for us. So we're like, shoot, we don't have that many people to do that and move cargo into a war zone. So what did we do? We went to conferences in Europe, and we found somebody. And we found somebody in a company that was willing to go final mile all the way to Ukraine to deliver. And it was interesting, very friendly. We got their business cards. We were able to connect with them in our location. Had dinner. It was great. I remember going back to station, and I happened to bump into my one of my colleagues, and she was like, "Who did you guys meet with last night?" And I'm like, "Oh, here are their business cards. We're getting ready to use them to support us and supporting and prosecuting the war." And a couple of days later, she came back and she said, "Did you actually meet with these people?" We're like, "Yeah, I mean, we had a great dinner." And she's like, "Do not ever meet with them again." And I said, "Well, they even paid for dinner. I mean, it was so nice." And it got nice wine and all that, European wine. And come to find out that these were a group of people that, none of us in this room would really want to do any kind of business with. But the reason I say that is we've all talked about a lot of things here about personnel, people, vendors, but vetting the people and knowing who you're doing business with. The Chinese are out there to try to, certainly upset the balance of this strategic competition that we have. So when you start to go out there, obviously you're not going to be put in a position, certainly, hopefully, that we were in trying to prosecute a war, but it's almost just as dangerous in somebody getting into your system and upsetting the balance of what you do. So as you guys start to build these relationships, maybe that's not the first question you ask, but it should be one of the second questions is, who really am I doing business with? Especially when we're dealing with mines and processing and hundreds of different transactions that deal with people that aren't Americans, not allies, that we're gonna have to rely on. Knowing who is in your supply chain is gonna be the most important event you're gonna have going forward to ensure that you don't trip up and we don't upset the balance of our warfighter in the future. So with that, I want to thank Geoff, I want to thank Evanna, Dana, and Brad for their great counsel here. They'll be up here for you. Thank you for those questions, and thank you for everything that you do. This is a great event, and hopefully I'll see you later this afternoon. Thank you so much.